Exposure to the right means exposing for the shadows in our image. It means squeezing as much light into the sensor as we possibly can, but without going so far that we lose vital highlights. So what advantage does this give us? Well, when we're processing the image in Adobe Camera Raw, we don't have to lighten dark shadows. Now, if we don't have to do that, then any noise in the image is going to be kept to a minimum, which means we can increase the ISO with a bit more confidence. When we expose to the right, we also have quite a large latitude with colour, clarity and contrast. In my experience, processing the image is easier, quicker, and the overall result, better quality. So what are the disadvantages of exposure to the right? I suppose the main one is making an error and going a little bit too far with the procedure and then losing vital highlights that we need. But other than that, there aren't any. The thumbnails, as you can see here, can look weak in tone, lacking in contrast and colour, but that's the whole point of the technique. And we have to look past that to the image's potential. So what happens when we expose to the right, which is great for the shadows, but then we do lose some of the highlights that we desperately need? But if we reduce the exposure, the shadows start to go too dark. Well, that's a pretty good indicator that the light contrast is probably a little too great for our camera to capture. And bracketing the exposures is one way to address this. Now, most of the times when I'm using this exposure to the right technique, I don't need to blend more than one image, but that, of course, is a subject perhaps for another video. But I wonder if many of you can relate to this. Exposure to the right also has the potential to avoid those battles that we sometimes have with image editing. The ones where we fix one problem and we cause two others as a result. Now, with the image you're viewing on screen, it's pretty good conditions, but even here I've exposed to the right, because we can see that the sky is very pale and weak, but we do have tones in the highlights. And I've held as much of the shadows in the boat on the left hand side as I possibly can. Had I exposed for the sky would have had a much more dramatic look, perhaps as a thumbnail, but then we'd have more difficulty in raising tones from those shadows. Maybe we could, sometimes we can't do that as effectively as we'd like. But if we expose to the right and we haven't lost those highlights in the sky, then the latitude for our processing is much greater. This image we're viewing in Photoshop's bridge is a good example of exposure to the right, where we've squeezed as much light into the shadow foreground as possible. To do that, we've had to give the image 2 stops more exposure than the camera would have given. That's doubling the exposure twice. Now, the highlights are as far as we can take them without losing some of the pixels in the light area on the right hand side just above that mountain. So with this image opened up into Adobe Camera Raw, I know the foreground's good. I'm going to go for speed to the auto button. Straight away we've got a pretty good result. All we really need is a graduated filter at the top, a little vignette and a little touch of the highlights just above that mountain. I've been using the exposure to the right technique for some years now, when it's appropriate to do so of course, but I have noticed that the exposure latitude of the modern cameras is getting better. It's something I've noticed with the Canon, R5.